Hello, everyone. I hope everyone's morning is off to a great start. I'm Ayushi Gupta, a graduate student at Harvard Kennedy School and the programming chair at the Behavioral Insights Student Group. On behalf of my team, I'd like to welcome you all to another BISG event. A little bit about us. We were launched in 2013 under the leadership of Faculty Director Todd Rogers. BISG brings together Harvard's outstanding group of decision research scholars, behavioral economists, behavioral scientists to focus on improving how decisions are made by leaders, organizations, and individuals alike. With a member base of over 2,000 people, BISG hosts events throughout the year for students and professionals interested in the powerful applications of behavioral insights. And we're excited to have you join us for today's discussion. Before I introduce the speaker, I'd like to state some housekeeping rules. During the duration of the event, we will have reserved the last 15 to 20 minutes for questions from the audiences. So please use the Q&A part of the webinar liberally to kind of submit the questions that you have in mind for Adam. It is indeed my honor to introduce today's speaker, Adam Galinsky, the Vice Dean for Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion, and the Paul Calello Professor of Leadership and Ethics at Columbia Business School. Professor Galinsky has published more than 300 scientific articles, chapters, and teaching cases in the fields of management and social psychology. His research and teaching focuses on leadership, negotiations, diversity, decision-making, and ethics. Professor Galinsky also co-authored the best-selling book, Friend and Foe, which offers a radically new perspective on conflict and cooperation. The book has had roaring positive reviews from New York Times, Financial Times, Economist. His TED Talk, How to Speak Up for Yourself, is also one of the most popular with over 7.4 million views. In his latest book, Inspire, Adam Galinsky scientifically unpacks the three universal dimensions of inspirational leadership and provides practical pathways for anyone to become more influential. Drawing from decades of research on leadership, decision-making, and negotiations, Galinsky reveals how individuals can cultivate the necessary skills to lead with impact, whether in boardroom, the classroom, or everyday life. So without further delay, over to you, Professor, and thank you so much for joining BISG today.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm so happy to be here. It's a great honor and privilege to be part of this amazing group and organization. And I've heard so much about BISG, and so I'm just honored and thrilled to be here. I'm going to tell you a little bit today about my book, Inspire, right? The Universal Path for Leading Yourself and Others. I'm going to start with a little story about Captain Tammy Jo Schultz, who was flying Southwest Airlines 1380 a few years ago when suddenly she felt a jolt. And the jolt was so strong that she felt like they had a midair collision with like a Mack truck. Like that's how abrupt it was. And then she quickly realized not only was the plane appear to have been shaken, but there seemed to be a hole in it because she was starting to lose oxygen and there was compression problems. Hydraulic lines seemed to be cut. And she realized that this was not going to be a normal flight. The ordinary everyday experience of flying had been radically altered. Now, what happened was the left engine had exploded, actually tore a hole in the side of the plane. And you can see in this one window, a passenger was fatally sucked into that hole. And so the first thing that Tammy Jo Schultz did is she stayed the course. Right. And she tried to figure out what was happening in there. And as she later described, he said, the plane wanted to descend, so we let it descend. But this is where her leadership became particularly remarkable. She understood that she was not only a pilot of these passengers, but also their protector. And she uttered 10 words at that moment in time that were utterly transformational for the passengers. They were panicking. They thought they saw the plane going down. They thought they were crashing. She got on the intercom and she said, "We are not going down. We are going to Philly." And that just changed everything from panic to hope and possibility. Now, she unbelievably, miraculously landed this plane elegantly with no further injuries except for that one poor passenger who had been sucked into the window. And when she landed, she did a second remarkable thing. She went row by row and made sure that every passenger was okay. And she looked them in the eye and she talked to them. She talked to a little girl and told her how special she was. And later on, Tammy Jo Schultz reflected on the fact that the media made such a big deal about her stroll down the aisle, even more than what it took to essentially land this crippled plane. Now, in the final part of the story I tell you is she was being attended to by EMT people afterwards. And the EMT person said, "How did you get through security?" And she was like, what are you talking about?" He said, "How did your nerves of steel not set off all the alarms? You're completely calm. Your heart rate is normal. Your physiology is normal. It does not look like you've gone through any type of crisis situation." Um, and so this is a remarkable pilot who, through her competence and leadership, saved everyone on board, including herself, but not only saved them, made them feel in a better psychological state. Now, I'll tell you about another captain of a vessel, the Costa Concordia, Francesco Centino. On this flight, his mistress was on board and he was trying to impress her, and he got too close to shore and he tore a 150-foot hole in the side of his plane of his ship. Sorry. And now normally what you do is you'd immediately set the alarms, let everyone know, and start the evacuation process. But that's not what he did. He spent the next hour trying to figure out what his story will be. There's an electrical blackout. He tried to say the electrical blackout caused the damage rather than the accident causing the damage. By the time he finally got on with the Coast Guard, he dithered for another 20 minutes. It was about 90 minutes before the alarm was blared, and many people said they didn't hear it. Dozens, over 100 people lost their lives, many people injured, and Chatino was not one of them, because while everyone else was drowning, he was safely on board a lifeboat. Now, you might not recognize Francesco Schettino on the lifeboat because somehow he miraculously had an opportunity to change from his captain's uniform to his civilian clothes. So while other people, they say the captain goes down with the ship, not in this case. Ship went down and he was far away. He ended up spending sentenced to over a decade in prison. And I like starting off this story with these two captains. They are captains of vessels with many passengers on board, but they couldn't be more different. It's not just their difference in gender or nationality, it's how they acted in a crisis. Tammy Jo Schultz was inspiring, and Francesco Centino was infuriating. He was so infuriating, you can hear the Coast Guard people screaming at him, their blood boiling, threatening to get revenge on him. And I've been asking people for 2 decades a very simple question. I've asked them to think about a Schettino in their own life and tell me about someone who inspired them. And once you do that for a second, just think for a minute about someone who's inspired you. That person can come from your family, like a parent or grandparent or sibling. They could come from, from when you're younger, a teacher, a counselor, a coach. They could come from today, your current boss or a past boss. They can come from anywhere. But what really unifies these inspirational figures is they changed you inside. They created this warmth and energy, this hope and possibility. Now, I also want you to think about another leader that another leader that affected you inside. But instead of creating this wellspring of hope and possibility, they created a seething cauldron of rage and resentment, exactly what the Coast Guard felt against Schettino in the way that he was acting. I want you to really think about, what was it about this person that made your blood boil? And so I've been asking this question for 2 decades of tens of thousands of people across the globe. Tell me about a leader that inspired you. What was it about this person? And tell me about a leader that infuriated. What was it about that person? And through that comparative analysis, I've come up with a realization that the inspiring and infuriating leader are really mirror images of each other. Tammy Jo Schultz could see the big picture, right? Schettino was lost in the weeds. Schultz was calm and courageous, right? He was anxious and frenetic, right? And then finally, she was generous and compassionate and focused on others, and he was only focused on himself. So these are sort of mirror images of each other. But I'm going to share with you a couple other important insights. The second one is this universal, this continuum between inspiring fear and leader is really universal. It exists in every country in the world. There's not a single characteristic that's mentioned in one country that's not mentioned in every country. So that really tells us it's hardwired in the human brain to be inspired or infuriated by the leaders around us. And then the third insight is that this universal continuum is really made up of these three factors, what I call visionary, which is how we see the world, exemplar, how we are in the world, and mentor, how we interact in the world. And I'm going to share sort of 5 big ideas today with you. Now, I call this the Venn diagram of inspiring leadership to help you sort of have a mnemonic device to remember it. Here's the first big idea, which I've already said is inspiring and infuriating leaders exist on an enduring continuum that's made up of 3 universal factors, truly universal. Now, the second big idea is that the reason why these are the 3 universal factors, being visionary, being exemplar, and being a great mentor, is because they each fulfill a fundamental human need. So visionary fulfills the fundamental human need for meaning and understanding. Exemplar fulfills the fundamental human need for protection and passion. And mentor fulfills the fundamental human need for belonging and status. So the first big idea is that there's this universal continuum that's made up of 3 universal factors. The 3 universal factors are visionary, exemplar, mentor. And the second big idea is that these are the 3 universal factors because they each satisfy a fundamental human need. So the third big idea is that when we are in a position of leadership or anytime someone's giving us their attention, we will inspire or infuriate because leaders are a big deal. And I'll tell you a little story about my first day as a PhD student at Princeton University. I took a class with a guy named Danny Kahneman, who would one day win the Nobel Prize in economics. He very sadly passed away recently. And Danny Kahneman, I was there. There were 11 other graduate students. It was my first class I'd ever taken, 3-hour seminar. And I raised my hand with something that I thought was insightful to say. And I still remember the 4 behavioral things that Danny did that day. Crossed his arms, shook his head. He scrunched up his face and he said, "That's not right at all." Now, the rest of the class moved on, but I didn't. I was frozen in place, right? That humiliating criticism, like reverberated inside of me. That's not right at all. And it would take me weeks to speak in any class, not alone Danny's class. But about 6 weeks later, I ran into Danny in the hallway and he passed me and very nonchalantly said, "Hey, Adam, I love reading your reflection papers. You're a great writer." And I was so thrilled that I literally skipped down the hallway. Now, these 2 very different Danny Kahneman stories represent the exact same phenomenon that I have coined called the leader amplification effect. And the leader amplification effect says that every time we're in a position of leadership, anytime someone's giving us our attention, everything we do gets amplified, right? So Danny's constructive comment or reaction became humiliating criticism. But his compliment, because of his position of leadership, became glorious praise. And this leader amplification effect doesn't just mean that our criticism and praise get amplified, but all of our communication. So imagine you get this text message from a friend of yours that says, "I need to talk to you." Now, you might be like a little like, "What's going on here?" Maybe a worried, but just a little bit. But now imagine that same text came from your boss. It would literally scream off the page, "I need to talk to you. I need to talk to you. I need to talk to you." And I discovered this when I was a young assistant professor, a doctoral student named Gail Berger. I saw her in the morning at 9 o'clock in the morning. I said, "Hey, Gail, come by my office at 3 p.m. I need to talk to you." And when Gail walked to my office 6 hours later, I was very surprised that she was in a crouched position and she looked really afraid. And I was really surprised because all I wanted to do was just go over a couple of research materials with her. And I still remember what she did that day. She slammed her fist on the table, yelled at me, and said, "Never do that to me again." Like, "Oh my God, do what?" She said, "Never tell me you need to talk to me." Right? For the last 6, and without telling me why. For the last 6 hours, I was like, "Is Adam mad at me? Someone else mad at me? Am I going to lose a resource?" Now, at first, I thought Gail's neurotic. Turns out Gail is a little neurotic. But the next day, the chair of my department sent me an email that said, "Hey, Adam, come by my office. I need to talk to you." And I walked in on that framed, frozen couch, right? So everything gets amplified, even ambiguity. But here's another thing that gets amplified: our silence. So another plain story. This is a plane flying from Denver to Montana. It dropped 1,000 feet in 12 seconds. That's like jumping off the Eiffel Tower, top of the Eiffel Tower. Now, when a plane goes down, things inside that plane rapidly go up. This is a true story. A baby flew out of its mom's arms, but was somehow miraculously caught. A flight attendant wasn't so lucky. She hit her head so hard in the ceiling that she lost consciousness and never regained it until after the flight was over. And what happened next was remarkable, because what happened next was nothing. Pilots never said a word. My twin brother talked about the fear that seized him. He was on that plane. He was worried that the plane had been damaged or the captains had been hurt. And he's like, I was basically forced to sit there in terror, right? They should have reassured me in the process. And he called it a deafening silence. So even our silence gets amplified when we're in a position of leadership. So how do we solve and leverage the leader amplification effect? Well, it requires something that I've been studying since 1995, so literally 30 years now, as topic of my dissertation at Princeton. It's called perspective taking. We have to take the perspective of our followers and think about how they might be affected by our own behavior. So let's go back to my comment to Gail. Come by my office at 3 p.m. I need to talk to you. Imagine I said this and said, Gail, come by my office at 3 p.m. We can review your research materials. Notice that both of these are 13 words. It would have cost me nothing, right, to have said this, but it required me to recognize that she can't see inside my own head and know that what I had to say wasn't scary. Or let's go back to the deafening silence. Whenever you're in a position of leadership and you know that people are afraid or feeling uncertain, let's replace that silence with a form of reassurance. And finally, we can leverage this. Think about the compliment that Danny Kahneman gave me and the joy it gave me because of his position of leadership, right? We can look to compliment people more. And I'm going to come back to this in a minute for the things that they do to say that you really hit that presentation out of the park. That was amazing. That was great. So the reason why I start off with this is because we have this universal continuum made up of these three universal factors. But those factors really matter when we're in positional leaderships because our behavior is a big deal. We do not have a choice of whether to inspire or not. We will always have an impact. We're never going to be neutral, but we have a choice of the type of impact we're going to have. Will we inspire or will we infuriate? So we have no choice on whether to have impact, but only on the type of impact. So I want to break down each of these three universal factors over the next few minutes. And so let's start off with visionary. I like to ask this question of whether you have kids. Now, turns out that when you have kids, your life gets worse. This is true for men and women. And let's go back to the pandemic. Now, when you didn't have kids in the pandemic, you could have started doing fun things. But these are my kids during the pandemic, creating just a colossal waste or mess right here. And so one of the things that's bedeviled evolutionary sort of psychologists is given our life gets worse when you have kids, why hasn't our species died off? And the reason why is that our kids, we are biologically conditioned to find a sense of meaning and purpose. So what our kids provide is that sense of meaning, purpose. And so that's what we feel, even when we're sleep deprived, even when we haven't eaten, even when our house is a mess, our body's a mess, our mind's a mess. Now, it doesn't mean you have to have kids to have that sense of meaning and purpose. We're all biologically conditioned to crave meaning and purpose, regardless of whether we have kids. I love this quote. This is a picture of my kids in better times, more recently. And I love this quote from Nietzsche. People who have a why to live can bear almost every how. And we want to give people a big picture optimistic why. That's what Tammy Jo Schultz did. She gave them an optimistic why. We're not going down, we're going to fill it. And so visionary is universally inspiring because it satisfies the human need for meaning and understanding. Now, to understand this, I want to show you a little experiment that started that was done almost 50 years ago now, 1974, I guess over 50 years ago. And I've done this all over the world. I've shown this to people, and less than 5% of people can solve this. But this really helps you what happens when we don't have a sense of understanding, right? The procedure is actually quite simple. First, you rank things in different groups. Of course, one problem may be sufficient, but you might have to go somewhere else, right? But don't overdo things because it's better not to do too few things at once. And then after the procedure is completed, you sort things back in the materials. So for most people, this is very confusing. It's perplexing. It lacks coherence. But there's another part of this experiment done with Marcia Johnson, who's at Yale University. She gave half our participants a title. And I want you to notice how everything changes when you get the title, right? Everything becomes clear. Everything makes sense. Every sentence builds off the other sentence. And the title is, drum roll, doing the laundry, right? Now we get it, right? Whites and darks. If we don't have laundry machines, we have to go somewhere else. We don't want to overstuff it because we can break it. Then we put the clothes back into the proper places, right? And so every sentence takes on meaning, right? Every sentence connects and coordinates. Everyone has the same shared vision. And the reason why I love this example is because it's so clear for you as you hear it and see the difference. But it's also what happened next in Marcia's experiments, Marcia Johnson's experiment. She later gave people a memory test. And the people who got the title, well, they didn't remember it word for word, but they remember the gist that there's something about laundry. The people who didn't get the title didn't even remember reading everything, right? It just, they lacked a sense of coherence to even process the information about them. So the first thing we want to do to be visionary is have that big picture optimistic why, right? Now, the second thing we do is we got to reduce it to its simplest and most digestible form. I call this the inception rule from the movie Inception, where the person says, it's not about how deep you go in people's dreams to plant an idea in their head. It's how simple the idea is. So grow naturally in the subject's mind. And one of my favorite examples of how simple vision can help people navigate a crisis is the company Zoom. And so what a simple vision does, it helps you simplify decision making. So many of you we're on Zoom right now. Many of you have probably never heard of Zoom before 2020, and they suddenly burst on the scene when they helped everyone feel connected across the world. Now, their tagline is delivering happiness. And they realized as the whole world was becoming dependent on Zoom for connections, that if they wanted to deliver happiness, a couple things needed to happen. The first is they need to have the exact right level of functionality. Too many features and people get overwhelmed. Their happiness goes down, but too few and people can't do what they want to do. So they worked really hard on having the Goldilocks number of features. Now, the second thing is they realized that people would have difficulties and they needed help using it. So they realized there's nothing more frustrating or infuriating or happiness reducing than long wait times for customer representatives. So they invested heavily in customer representatives, which actually worked out in the pandemic because they could hire people, and who could work out of their homes. So notice how this simple vision, deliver happiness, allow them to navigate a crisis and make really important, like critical decisions at various moments in time. Now, the final thing you have to do is you have to take this big picture optimistic why that's been simplified and then repeat it again, again, and again. And I've done research showing the power of repetition, right? How much when people repeat a core idea in their entrepreneurial pitch, they're more likely to get funded. When they repeat the core idea in their statement about their app on the iPhone store, they're more likely to be purchased. And even when people repeat the core idea in a TED Talk, they're more likely to be not just seen, but also get more comments or engagements. I've also been an expert witness in more than a dozen legal cases about reputation that have earned more than 1 billion in settlements and verdicts or judgments. And my primary argument is the power of repetition to affect people's reputation. And so you got to repeat. So what does it mean to be visionary? A visionary is an optimistic values-based vision that is simplified, visualized, and repeated. So how do we get into a visionary state of mind? Well, what research shows is it helps to get in a visionary state of mind and see the big picture when we reflect on our values. We think about what really matters to us. And let me tell you about a little study that we did. We took newly unemployed people in Switzerland, and when they came in to register for unemployment benefits, for half of them, we said, please list up the 5 values that are important to you. Why are they important? And tell us, how have you demonstrated those values in your life? 2 months later, they were more likely to have get a job offer than those in control condition. This effect of reflecting on your values was so strong in helping them see that optimistic why that engaged them and pushed them forward that we had to end the experiment and give everybody the intervention. So, visionary is the first universal factor of inspiring others because it satisfies the core fundamental need for meaning understanding. It is represented with a big picture optimistic why that's simplified and repeated, and we can get into a visionary state of mind by reflecting on our values. Now, the second one is how we are in the world, and that's being an exemplar. I'm going to show you two pictures now. One is of George Washington, the famous crossing the Delaware at the Met Museum. The other is Bubalina, who was a heroine in Greece. Now, both of these are two individuals that fought for their country's independence. But notice where the leader is, right? Bubalina and George Washington. They're both in the lead boat. They're both standing up in the boat. They're both taking on the most risk. They are courageous protectors. They're also resolute. They're calm. And so inspiring leaders also tend to be what I call the eye of the hurricane. So an inspiring leader is a calm and courageous protector, right? That's how Tammy Jo Schultz saw herself, as a calm and courageous protector of her passengers, whereas Schettino only focused on himself. Now, the second thing that really makes up exemplar, I'm going to ask you a question to tell me about a passion of yours. And if I asked you this and we were sitting together and I observed your behavior, I would notice it. So I do this exercise where I ask people to describe a passion to their partner sitting next to them. And then I say to the partner, what did you notice about the person when they started to describe their passion? And it always follows a familiar path. They'll say, oh, their eyes lit up and sparkled. Oh, they smiled a big beaming smile. Wow, they talk so fast. They use their hands. They leaned in of telling me a secret. And so we can see that when we describe a passion, it's in our eyes, it's in our mouth, it's in our throat, in our hands, it's in our body. And so then I ask people, tell me about like what happened to you while you were listening to that. They're like, well, my eyes started lighting up. I started smiling. I started leaning in. So it's really hard for you to inspire someone else when you yourself aren't inspired. So that's the first key insight of this. The second key insight is notice that all these behaviors happen spontaneously and simultaneous. Now imagine you tried to fake it, right? You try to act passionate even when you weren't, like, okay, I got to make my eyes big. Okay, now I got to smile and I got to move my hands. So this tells us that passion and authenticity are deeply linked together. Now, I've shown this in my research. We analyzed dragon's den, which like the Canadian shark's tank, for how much passion was being emitted by people seeking funding from the dragon's den. And we showed that if they were high on the dimension of passion, they were about 50% more likely to receive funding, right? And so authentic passion is really, really important. Now, it's even more important as a leader because of the leader amplification effect, right? So your emotions really matter as a leader. Tammy Jo Schultz was calm. She made her passengers calm, right? When you're passionate, you percolate passion in others. But when you're anxious, right, or passionless, you also impact people because of leader amplification effect. So the leader amplification effect makes our emotions not just contagious, but truly infectious. So, why is being an exemplar so inspiring? It's because it satisfies the fundamental human need for protection and that propulsion and energy that it gives us. Now, the final thing I want to say about being a exemplar of desired behavior is you want to exemplify your vision and not be a hypocrite. You want to act consistent with your vision. So this is connects, right? Being visionary, you want to present that optimistic, meaningful, big picture why, and then you want to exemplify it in your own behavior. Otherwise, you're a hypocrite. So an exemplar desired behavior is a calm and courageous protector who's authentically passionate and consistent. So how do we get into an exemplar state of front mind? I want to tell you a story about one of my former students, Jillian Koo. She was giving a job talk at London Business School for a professorship, and they gave her about a half an hour before a talk. And she decided to write down a little story about her own life, an episode. Now, this wasn't a random thing she did. It was based on research that I had done. And this is what we did. We asked people in our research to please recall time when you had power, describe the situation you had power, what happened, how you felt. And Jillian said as she wrote this essay, she could feel confidence course through her veins. Right? She could feel that confidence in her blood. She said, I felt super, and then I went and acted super. And we've actually then shown this in our own research, right? When we give people this power prime, they're more likely before a job interview, they're more likely to do a better job. So we show that the power gets the job, right? Getting to exemplar state of mind increases the probability that you get this great outcome. So I'm going to give you the third dimension, universal dimension of inspiring leadership, and that's being a great mentor, how we interact with others, right? Think Tammy Jo Shull going row by row and making sure everyone's okay. And to understand this particular feature, I'm going to give you a physics problem. It's my Dean McLauris. When you put force and pressure on an object, what direction does it go? Well, he puts force in this option, and it goes in the direction of the force. Newton's first law of physics. Now let's change one word. The other word object, I'm going to call it person. When you put force and pressure on a person, what direction does it go? Well, Dean McLauris puts force and pressure on me, and I push back, right? So if you remember nothing else from today, I want you to remember these three words. People aren't objects. If people are objects, leadership would be a physics problem, right? And we could just do force and pressure, people go around, but people aren't objects. We react against. And so that tells us something really fundamental. So don't treat people like objects, treat people like people. What does that mean to treat people like people? Well, it means you empower others. And I have this quote from Confucius I really love. Tell me and I will forget. Show me and I may remember. Involve me and I understand. When you involve people, right? And as a leader, we can involve people by letting one of our employees, let's say, make an important presentation, or we can keep them in the loop on important correspondence with a client of ours, for example. But we really change people when we bring them onto the field instead of just being on the stands. We change their perspective, and we fundamentally change what they can see and do when we involve them in our activities. Now, the other thing that it means to treat people like people is we elevate others. And a universal a dimension of inspiration and inspiration is sharing credit versus stealing credit. Inspiring leaders share credit and take on blame and responsibility. Inspiring leaders do the worst. They steal credit and put all the blame on others. That's what Chatino did. He put the blame on everyone else, right, in the process. And I've shown in my research that there's nothing more infuriating than having someone else steal credit. Now, but here's a cool thing to know that when we share credit with others, like as a leader, not only does it have a huge impact because of the leader amplification effect, but we look better in the eyes of others. I've shown that it expands the status pie, that when we acknowledge the contributions of others, they gain in status. We actually gain in status too. And I'll tell you a story about Sir Dave Brailsford, who was so remarkable. He was knighted by the Queen of England because he took the British cycling team from the cellar and made them the top Olympic cycling team in the world. Then he conquered the Tour de France. He created Team Sky and they won 6 Tour de France's over a 7-year period. And I was on a panel with him. And he talked about one of the secrets to success is cycling is an amazing sport. It is a team sport, but only one person gets all the glory. Team sport, but only one person gets all the glory. So what does he do in this case? Well, he recognizes he needs everyone on board, working hard, even though they're not getting the recognition. He gives them the recognition. He says, I expand the status pie by highlighting the unique contributions of each team member to that day's success. And finally, inspiring mentors empathize with others. Tammy Jo Schultz understood her passengers were scared. That's why she went row by row. So inspiring mentors empower people, they elevate others, and they empathize with others. And this is universal because being an inspiring mentor satisfies the fundamental human need for belonging and status. So how do we get into a mentor state of mind? We get into a mentor state of mind by actually thinking about all the value that we can get from the people around us, even those below us in the hierarchy. So we did a simple study where we asked the mentors to think about a time in which they learned from someone with less power than themselves. And the other condition, they said, think about a time you learned from someone with more power than yourself. And then we looked at the quality of their mentorship and the people that have focused on what they can learn from others. They were rated as higher mentors. And I'll tell you a very quick story. I'm here in Hawaii in a house that I lived in for 10 months when I wrote this book, when I was on sabbatical. And we had this problem in this beautiful house in Hawaii where birds would come in, get scared, and poop everywhere. And it was a total, a mess. And I was telling a friend of mine, he's like, "Oh, I just saw this article in the Journal of American Medical Association about how you can put um, fake snakes down and the birds won't come anywhere near your house." So I bought fake snakes, put them out in the lanai, and the birds would look at the snakes, step over them, come into our house, fly everywhere, and poop everywhere. And so I was telling my friend on the phone at 6 o'clock in the morning, just like it is here, 6 o'clock in the morning. And my son, who was at the time 5, woke up. He was going to preschool in Hawaii. And he said, "Dad, I know why the snakes aren't working." I was like, "Why?" He said, "There's no snakes in Hawaii. We learned this in preschool." So this idea that we can even learn new insights from our kids, from people below us in the hierarchy, is very powerful. So I've given you 3 big ideas so far. The first big idea is that there is an enduring continuum between inspiring and infuriating leaders that's made up of 3 universal factors. These are the 3 universal factors: visionary, how we see the world; exemplar, how we are in the world; and mentor, how we interact in the world, because they satisfy a fundamental human need: visionary, understanding and meaning; exemplar, right, protection and passion; mentor, the satisfies that need for belonging and status. The third big insight is that when we're in a position of leadership, we don't have a choice of whether to impact others, right? We will inspire or infuriate. We do have a choice of which one of those we do. Now, I want to give you the fourth big insight. And the fourth big idea is inspiring leaders aren't just born, they can be made. I have given a toolkit today. I have given you the key ingredients of what it means to be inspire people through your vision, through your presence, and through your interactions. That means that all of us can learn those attributes, we can practice those attributes, and we can develop those characteristics so that we become more inspiring over time. And then the fifth big idea is I'm going to give you a new acronym I created called reap what you sow. Now, in the Bible, reap what you sow means whatever we put out in the world comes back to us. And so if we put out inspiration in the world, we get inspirational energy back. But in this case, I've changed the word reap into a homonym of REAP into REIP because it's an acronym. And so, how do you reap what you sow? Well, the first thing you need to do is you need to reflect on your experiences. Once a month, reflect on: have I been inspiring or have I been infuriating? In what ways was I infuriating? Why was I infuriating? And that can allow us to start to tailor our preparation and behavior. I haven't been very visionary. I can reflect on my values to get into a visionary state of mind, right? Second thing is do what I've asked tens of thousands of people to do across the globe: to uh, think about the inspiring leaders from their own life, and then try to emulate how they inspired you. How do they inspire other people? So then we can take those reflections and emulations and we can turn them into intentions, right? Turn our reflections into intentions, a small commitment that we're going to do. I'm going to make sure I simplify my message. I'm going to make sure that I communicate my passion. I'm going to make sure that I involve other people and empower them. And then we can practice that over a period of time. And by turning our intention to practice, we can maybe turn them into habits, right? So that we're more inspiring more of the time. But I want to end with one final way that you, everyone out there, can inspire others. And it's tell a story about my parents. These are pictures of my parents when they were young. And when we're young, our parents kind of inspire us, right? They're superheroes, they're gods in our mind, right? But over time, we learn the fundamental truth about our parents, which is they're not perfect. My dad was so visionary. He was so empathic. He was courageous. My favorite memory is being held in the ocean in his arms, that calm and courageous protection. But he had an infuriating flaw. He would have these explosive volcanic eruptions of temper tantrums when we would literally spill milk, right? And my mom, she was so focused on others, like just trying to meet their needs. But she was also had a infuriating flaw. Her anxiety would sometimes get in the way. Um, but there's something about my parents that truly inspired, and that's they tried to be a better person yesterday today than they were yesterday, and a better person tomorrow. And this is what I wrote about my parents in a memorial speech for my mom. I eventually discovered what we discovered about our parents. They weren't perfect. They each had infuriating flaws. What made them truly inspiring is they each try to be a better person today than they were yesterday. They're committed to being a better person tomorrow than they were today. So that means that each and every one of you can be more inspiring. So I just want to summarize these 5 really big ideas, and then we'll open it up to questions. Here's the first big idea, that there is a universal enduring continuum of inspiring versus inferior leaders that's made up of 3 universal factors. Visionary, how we see the world, that optimistic big picture why, simplified and repeated. Exemplar, how we are in the world, right? That calm and courageous protection, authentically passionate and consistent, and how we interact in the world, being that inspiring mentor, empowering people, elevating people, empathizing with them. Now, these are the 3 universal factors because they each satisfy a fundamental human need. Now, you will impact people in your position of leadership. That's the third big idea. But you have great power over the type of impact you have, inspiring or infuriating. The fourth big insight is that leaders are made, not just born. You can learn all of these characteristics, become more inspiring yourself, right? And finally, we can reap what we sow by setting up a pattern of reflection that allows us to be more inspiring more of the time. And with that, I'm happy to answer any questions. I see there's a Q&A already available for me. So the first question I see here is, are there any particular traits that introverts have that help them in leadership? Any advice for introverted leaders? And that's a great question. And I think, one of the things that we can do, and I think this is really important, is extroverted people talk, right? And they interact with a wider range of people because they get energy from other people, right? So what do we do as an introvert? Well, the first thing I would say is, well, where can you get your energy from? And we can get energy from our passion. So research shows that introverted leaders, when they're talking about their passions, are just as animated as extroverted leaders are. So the first key thing you can do as an introvert is really focus on your passion, right? The second thing you can do is you can think about what's the optimistic why that you want to communicate and really practice that. And so another thing we know is that when introverts feel prepared to speak, they feel more comfortable speaking. So one of the things I tell people to do is, like, you want to involve people, but you don't want to put people on the spot. So when you're in a group meeting, you don't want to say, hey, Sarah, share your perspective. And Sarah's like, whoa, I wasn't expecting this to happen. So I say, look, give people a heads up, right? Say, hey, tomorrow in the meeting, I'm going to ask you for your perspective, Sarah. That allows her to prepare. But introverts also tend to be more empathic towards others. And so you can also lean in the ways they tend to involve others. So there's this huge advantage on the mentor side for sometimes introverted leaders. So again, these are all traits that we can practice to do that. And then the second question I have is, what if as a leader, you aren't authentically passionate about topic, but you know it's critically important to your employees to be passionate about the topic? How can you approach this challenge, right? And I think that's a great question. And I think, again, the thing to focus on is what you are passionate about. So in this case, you care deeply about your employees' happiness. You're passionate about their happiness. So you know that you can see the even bigger picture. You might not be, psyched about cleaning the house. I'll just use an example, right? But it's such an important thing to make everyone happier. So you can, even if you don't love cleaning the house, you can focus on the end goal. I want to go back to the Nietzsche quote. If you have a why to live, you can bear almost every how, right? We can suffer the slings and arrows of outrageous fortune when we have that larger sense of purpose and meaning. And yeah, please, are there any other questions that people have out there? I'm happy to. Yep.
Thank you so much, Adam. We also had a bunch of questions that were poured in earlier while they were registering for the talk, and I'm happy to kind of put them to you.
Yeah.
I think the first 2 you've already covered, but there was one question about what are the powerful narratives to catalyze the critical mass needed to accelerate transformational change. That was one of the questions that was posed, and I'm happy to follow up a bit more as we go.
Okay. So what was the question? Sorry, I missed that.
Um, the person wanted to know what are the powerful narratives needed to catalyze critical mass needed to accelerate transformational change.
Yeah, I mean, I think again, it's about meeting people's fundamental needs, right? And so I want to go back to uh, think about President Trump, right, and his surprise victory in 2016 and even in 2024. And I think what he was really doing, he represents a lot of these, different things. He had a big picture, simple, optimistic why, make America great again. He presented himself as this exemplar, right, which is, that I am calm, courageous protector. Only he had this quote literally in his convention speech. Only I can, protect you, essentially. But he was also, he might not look like a great mentor, but he was really targeting these needs of belonging and status of the, forgotten part of America as we lost our base in manufacturing, for example. People who used to be on the higher end of the status hiker and felt like they were losing status. And so I think, again, what we can do is we can think about, what are the needs that people need? As the world gets more chaotic, people need a simpler sense of meaning and understanding.
That's great. We also had a very interesting question on the universality of leadership traits. It said that your research suggests that certain inspiring leadership traits are universal across cultures, but how can leaders adapt these universal principles to fit unique cultural contexts of their organization?
Yeah, I mean, I think the specifics might be in the content and not in the form, right? So we go back to what is the optimistic why that this group of people needs, right? And so that is probably going to be affected by the type of cultural icons that exist. One of the things, if you look at the number one speech in America in the um, uh, 18th century, it was the Gettysburg Address. If you look at the number one speech in the 20th century, or sorry, 19th century, 20th century was Martin Luther King's I Have a Dream. Both of them reference the Declaration of Independence and the idea of like, all men being created equal, right? So that's a resonating cultural icon that helps infuse whatever optimistic why they're trying to connect with, right? And that's kind of specific to America. So that's one way that we can do that. Some things are more universal than we think they are. Like authentic passion is universal. Like everyone can see a transformation in people when they start talking about their passion. How we involve people may vary, but involving people still matters. That sense of empowerment, the specifics of empowerment might change. Everyone wants their contributions to be acknowledged, regardless of the culture they come from.
We also have a question from Jen that's in the Q&A box. She
Okay.
says that if you're a lower status within the company and want to influence the higher ups, what is the most effective way to do this?
That's a great question. So one of the things that I tell people is, if you really want to be inspiring leader, what it's all about your own behavior, right? If you can be inspiring in your vision, even if you're not the vision setter, right? You can be inspired. You can be calm, courageous protector, even if you're not in the highest position. So one of the ways that we can do that is we can model our own behavior. The other thing we can do is we can communicate effectively to higher up. So here's just one example. Like, so I have this TED talk that's based on my research, how to speak up for yourself. And when we're in a low power position, asserting ourselves is always risky, right? Because it can backfire, right? We can face backlash if we step outside of what our range of acceptable behavior is. So we have to be a little bit more careful when we're in a lower status position. But one thing that research has shown, actually research that was done at Harvard has shown, is that when we are passionate about something, we're given a wider range of how we will behave. So that's one thing we can do. The second thing that we can do, both as an inspiring leader, and I talk a lot about this in the book, but also as someone below, is don't give people demands, but give them options, give them choices. And so I've shown, for example, in my research and negotiations, that when we give people, do you want this package or that package? Right? We can be more ambitious and aggressive and get a much better outcome for ourselves. But the other person is going to see us as being generally interested in reaching agreement, caring about the other side. They're going to trust us more. And they're going to walk away with not really a worse outcome. We're just going to get a better outcome. They're not going to be worse off. So, one of the things we can do when we're low power is to go to someone and say, hey, I had an idea. Which do you like better, going this path or that path, for example? And so we have to be a little bit more sensitive to how we present information when we're lower power, and make sure that it's not too confrontational or aggressive. One story I like to tell is McNamara is talking about someone who came up with the brilliant idea of the Cuban Missile Crisis to solve it with President Kennedy. And he says, Tommy Thompson said to the president, Mr. President, you're wrong. But if you actually listen to the audio, that's not what Tommy Thompson said. He said, Mr. President, I don't entirely agree. Right. So that's very different than saying you're wrong versus I totally entirely agree. Or, you could have said, Mr. President, actually, I see an alternative way we might look at this. Right. So it requires a little bit more understanding that low power people, low status people are expected to defer to high power people. So you have to be a little bit more careful and calibrated in your communication.
That was a great response, Adam. We also have one very interesting question on your own journey. It says that reflecting on your own career, what are the pivotal experiences that have shaped your understanding of inspirational leadership, and how have they influenced the insights shared in Inspire?
Yeah, it's a great question. So, I mean, there's certain things that happen in my own personal life, but there's also things that that happen in my research life. So, I'll tell you a really story how this whole project started. It was 2006. I was teaching the FBI, the Federal Bureau of Investigation, about high stakes leadership, or leadership in high stakes situations. And one person just started telling me about a leader that inspired them. And I noticed, kind of like the passion exercise, that they sat up, their eyes changed, they were animated, and it was like this energy was surging through them. So I asked the rest of the group, like, can you tell me about a leader that inspired you? And all of them could. And from that moment on, I did just change every way that I taught about leadership. I started asking people this question I've asked, today, which is, tell me about a leader that inspired you. And so I think those are really important. The story I told you about Gail was a huge transformational story for me when she walked in and not only looked crouched down because I'd asked her to come talk to me, but she slammed her fist and yelled at me and said, "Don't do this to me ever again." And that was right when I just started studying power. And I've been studying power for about 25 years now. But I realized that when I'm in a position of leadership, she was low power. She was dependent on me. And if I didn't communicate effectively, I could make her fears go wild. Right. And so you can really see how that is. Another quick example, I took the story of my brother's experience, the deafening silence, and I changed at Northwestern University. I took the computer technicians from the lowest rated on customer satisfaction to the highest rated by simply help them change what they did. You used to give your laptop to them. And so I'm a high status person, a professor, they're sort of lower status. But once they have my computer, they control this resource. They're in power. And you wouldn't hear from them for days on end. You're like, oh my God, is my computer broken? Have they lost it? Are they even looking at it? And so we put it like a little simple institute in a practice, which is every single day, you got to communicate with the faculty member about their computer, even if there's no changes. So you could say, hey, we're still backing up your hard drive. Hope to have that backed up by tomorrow. So every day they know that their computer isn't lost. They don't experience that deafening silence. And so I've really, tried, not always perfectly, to be, to institute some of these things. I'll just mention one last practice, which is, I coined the corollary phrase, the parent amplification effect, recognizing the power of my words and behavior on my kids, and recognizing that if I was like my dad and I erupted in volcanic, thing, how negatively that affected them. And so once we think about the world through this inspirational, infuriating lens, it gives us this incredible tool to make important choice in our lives, to be a better friend, a better spouse, a better parent, a better colleague.
What a wonderful response to kind of conclude the Q&A part of the session, Adam. It has truly been an honor of the BISG, and I'm sure also the attendees today to have you talk about your wonderful book and share the insights that you've shared with us today. I definitely came out feeling a more confident leader So thank you so much for all the wisdom that you've imparted, and we're very, very excited for the book and to kind of dive more into it. Thank you for taking out the time, to you and to the attendees, and for joining us for more such BISG events. Keep a lookout on your email. Thank you.
Um, Thank you. Someone asked really quickly if I could pass on my follow up my information, and it's just my full name at columbia.edu. Adam Galinsky at columbia.edu.